The city lights twinkled like stars as evening settled over the bustling downtown. James Robinson let out a tired sigh as he loosened his tie and checked his watch. It had been one of those days, back-to-back meetings since 7 a.m., 2 investor calls, and a visit to the community center his foundation had built in the East Side neighborhood where he grew up. At 43, James had built Blackstream Technologies from a small startup in his garage to a billion-dollar company that employed over 5,000 people. But looking at him now, in his slightly wrinkled blue button-down and comfortable khaki pants, you'd never guess he was one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs in the country. Maybe I should just grab takeout and head home, he mumbled to himself, scrolling through his phone. But then he remembered, his home was empty tonight. His wife had taken their kids to visit her parents for the weekend, and the thought of eating alone in their big house didn't appeal to him. That's when he spotted the warm glow of Le Ciel just down the block. The fancy French restaurant was known for its exclusive clientele and month-long waiting list. James had helped the owner secure funding for the place 3 years ago, but had never actually eaten there himself. Why not? He thought, slipping his phone into his pocket. He could treat himself to a good meal after the day he had. The doorman at Le Ciel gave James a quick once-over as he approached. His hesitation was slight but noticeable before he pulled open the heavy glass door with a stiff nod. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with the gentle murmur of conversation and the soft clink of expensive crystal. Chandelier light bounced off polished surfaces, and the rich smell of butter and wine filled the air. Well-dressed couples and groups occupied most tables, their jewelry catching the light as they laughed and talked. A tall, thin man with slicked back hair approached the entrance podium. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" His tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No, I don't," James admitted with a friendly smile. "I was hoping you might have a table available tonight." The maitre, his Nemeteg read Philip, tapped at his tablet with a slight frown. "Without a reservation, that's quite difficult. We're fully booked for the next 6 weeks." James wasn't used to pulling the "do you know who I am" card. It wasn't his style. But his stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since a quick sandwich at noon. "I understand," James said quietly. "I know the owner, David Chen. We worked together on the initial business plan for this place." Philip's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained skeptical. He looked again at James's casual clothes and the worn leather messenger bag slung over his shoulder. "One moment, please," he said finally, stepping away to make a quick phone call. James stood patiently, noticing how other arriving guests, dressed in expensive suits and glamorous dresses, were being warmly welcomed and immediately shown to their tables. A few curious glances came his way, some dismissive, others just mildly interested in why someone so underdressed was trying to get into Le Ciel. After a brief conversation, Philip returned. "It seems Mr. Chen is out of the country, but he has instructed us to accommodate you." His tone had shifted slightly, not quite warm but less dismissive. "We have a table in the back section. Will that be acceptable?" "That would be perfect, thank you," James replied. As Philip led him through the main dining area, James couldn't help but notice how they bypassed the central tables where business moguls and local celebrities were seated. Instead, they headed toward a darker corner near the kitchen entrance, where the ambient noise was louder and the glamour of the main room felt distant. "Your server will be with you shortly," Philip said, placing a menu on the table before quickly departing. James settled into his chair, watching the room from his secluded corner. He didn't mind the table location, he actually preferred it. From here, he could observe without being observed, think without interruption. He opened the leather-bound menu and smiled to himself. Tonight, he wasn't CEO James Robinson with a company valued at billions. Tonight, he was just a tired guy in casual clothes, looking for a good meal after a long day. Little did he know this quiet dinner was about to become much more complicated. James had just started looking through the menu when a tall waiter approached his table. The man had perfectly combed hair and a stiff posture that suggested years of fine dining service. His Nemeteg read Trevor. "Good evening," Trevor said, his voice notably cooler than the warm greetings James had overheard him giving to other tables just moments before. "Can I get you something to drink while you decide?" "Yes, I'd like to see your wine list, please," James said with a friendly smile. Trevor hesitated, his eyes quickly scanning James's casual outfit once more. "Our wines start at $90 a bottle," he said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "Perhaps you prefer a soda or iced tea." James had dealt with this kind of treatment before. As one of the few black CEOs in the tech industry, he'd grown accustomed to being underestimated based on his appearance. Usually he'd just go somewhere else, but tonight he was too hungry and too tired. "I'll still take that wine list," James replied calmly, maintaining eye contact. Trevor gave a tight-lipped smile and walked away, returning a moment later with a leather-bound wine menu that he placed at the edge of the table, as if reluctant to come too close. As James browsed the extensive selection, he could feel the waiter hovering impatiently. From the corner of his eye, he noticed how different Trevor's demeanor was with a white couple at a nearby table, all smiles and helpful suggestions. "I'll have the 2015 Chateau Margaux," James decided, pointing to one of the more expensive bottles on the list. Trevor's eyebrows shot up. "That's $650 a bottle, sir," he said loudly enough that people at nearby tables turned to look. "Are you sure that's what you want?" A heaviness settled in James's chest, that familiar feeling when someone was trying to make him feel small. He'd built a billion-dollar company from nothing, had spoken at global tech conferences, had even advised 2 presidents on digital innovation, yet here he was, being treated like he was trying to scam a free meal. "Yes, I'm sure," James replied, his voice steady despite the heat rising to his face. "We'll need to process the payment for the wine before I can bring it to the table," Trevor said, pulling out a credit card machine. "Restaurant policy for certain orders." James knew very well this wasn't standard policy. He had dined in the finest restaurants around the world, and he'd never been asked to prepay for anything. But rather than cause a scene, he simply handed over his black card. Trevor took the card between his thumb and forefinger as if it might be fake. When the payment went through, a flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by a practiced, neutral expression. "I'll be right back with your wine, sir," he said, his tone unchanged. As Trevor walked away, a couple at the next table caught James's eye. The woman shook her head slightly in disapproval, and the man frowned. They had witnessed the entire exchange. "That was completely inappropriate," the woman whispered to her partner, not realizing James could hear. "Should we say something to the manager?" "Not yet," her partner replied. "Let's see if it continues." James appreciated their concern, but focused on the menu instead. By the time Trevor returned with the wine and uncorked it with obvious reluctance, James had decided on his meal. "I'll have the beef Wellington to start, followed by the duck confit, and finish with the chocolate souffle," James said, closing his menu. "The souffle needs to be ordered at the beginning of the meal," Trevor replied, his tone suggesting James should have known this obvious fact. "And the beef Wellington is an entree, not an appetizer." "I'm aware," James said simply. "I'd like the Wellington as my first course." Trevor's lips pressed into a thin line. That's not how the chef intends the meal to be enjoyed. "I understand, but that's how I'd like to enjoy it," James insisted politely but firmly. 2 tables away, a group of businessmen in expensive suits ordered several courses out of traditional sequence, and Trevor had accommodated them with a smile and an "excellent choice, sir." "Fine," Trevor said curtly, snatching the menu from James's hands. "Anything else?" "None, thank you," James replied, maintaining his dignity despite the waiter's rudeness. As Trevor stormed off toward the kitchen, James took a sip of his wine and glanced around the restaurant. He noticed the couple at the next table now openly watching the situation unfold. The woman gave him a sympathetic smile, which he returned with a small nod. James had faced discrimination many times before, in boardrooms, at exclusive clubs, even at car dealerships when he'd shown up in jeans and a t-shirt. He never let it break his spirit. Tonight would be no different. He'd enjoy his meal despite the waiter's behavior, leave a generous tip to show he was the bigger person, and go home with his dignity intact. What James didn't know was that this particular incident would take an unexpected turn that none of them saw coming. The rich aroma of the beef Wellington arrived before the plate did. James looked up as Trevor placed the dish in front of him with barely concealed disdain. The delicate puff pastry was golden brown, and a perfect pink center peeked through where it had been sliced. "Enjoy," Trevor said flatly, the word carrying none of its intended meaning. "Thank you," James replied, genuinely appreciating the beautiful food despite the cold service. He had learned long ago that allowing other people's poor behavior to ruin his enjoyment of life only gave them power they didn't deserve. As he took his first bite, James closed his eyes briefly. The food was truly exceptional. Tender beef wrapped in mushroom duxelles, the pastry buttery and light. At least the chef's skill lived up to the restaurant's reputation, even if the service didn't. Throughout his meal, James couldn't help but notice how differently Trevor treated his other tables. The waiter practically hovered over a group of white executives, offering detailed descriptions of specials, making wine pairing suggestions, and checking on them every few minutes. Meanwhile, James had to wave twice just to get a water refill. At a table to his right, an older couple had been watching the situation unfold. The woman, with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, kept glancing over with a concerned expression. Her husband, a distinguished-looking man with glasses, whispered something to her, and she nodded in agreement. James pretended not to notice their attention. He'd been in this position many times before, being the unwilling center of a spectacle simply because someone in a position of service decided he didn't belong. Years of experience had taught him that making a scene rarely improved the situation and often just reinforced stereotypes about angry black men. When Trevor brought the duck confit, he practically dropped the plate on the table. "Will there be anything else?" he asked in a tone that clearly hoped the answer would be no. "Everything is wonderful, thank you," James said with genuine appreciation for the food. He refused to let this man's behavior diminish his enjoyment of a well-prepared meal. Trevor seemed almost disappointed by James's continued politeness. Perhaps he'd been hoping for an outburst, something to justify his poor treatment. Instead, he got nothing but calm dignity, which seemed to confuse him further. As the meal progressed, James noticed the couple to his right speaking with another staff member, their expressions serious. The employee nodded, looking over at James briefly before hurrying toward what appeared to be a manager's office. Trevor returned a few minutes later, this time accompanied by a woman in a tailored suit, clearly someone in management. She glanced at James, then whispered something to Trevor, whose face flushed red. He nodded curtly before walking away, and the manager approached James's table. "Good evening, sir," she said with a professional smile. "I'm Lisa, the floor manager. I just wanted to check that everything is to your satisfaction tonight." James understood immediately what had happened. The couple must have complained about how he was being treated. "The food is exceptional," he said truthfully. "Compliments to the chef." Lisa seemed to be waiting for more, perhaps for him to voice a complaint about Trevor, but James simply smiled and took another bite of his duck. "I'm glad to hear that," she said finally. "Please let me know if you need anything at all." As she walked away, James noticed Trevor watching from across the room, his expression a mix of confusion and irritation. The waiter had clearly been reprimanded, yet James hadn't said a word against him. When it came time for dessert, it was Lisa who brought the chocolate souffle to the table, not Trevor. "This is on the house tonight," she said with a genuine smile. "We appreciate your patience." James thanked her but made a mental note to leave enough cash to cover the full bill plus a generous tip. He never wanted special treatment, just equal treatment. As he savored the rich chocolate dessert, James reflected on the evening. He could have made a scene. He could have revealed who he was, pulled out his business cards, or name-dropped the celebrities and politicians in his contact list. But what would that have proven? That he deserved respect because of his status? No, he deserved respect simply because he was a human being, same as anyone else who walked through those doors. When it came time to leave, James placed his black credit card on the bill and added a 40% tip in cash. He wrote a simple note on a receipt. "The food was wonderful. Wishing you continued success." He would walk out the same way he walked in, with his head held high and his dignity intact, leaving them to discover the truth in their own time. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Trevor hit the snooze button twice before finally dragging himself out of bed. Last night's shift had been busy, and that difficult customer in the corner had left him feeling irritated. Still, the men had left a surprisingly generous tip despite the cold service, something that made Trevor feel a small twinge of guilt as he stepped into the shower. By the time he arrived at Le Ciel for the lunch shift, something felt different. The usual calm, professional atmosphere had been replaced with an unusual buzz of excitement and whispered conversations that stopped when he walked by. "What's going on?" Trevor asked Miguel, another waiter who was arranging silverware at the service station. Miguel gave him a strange look. "You haven't seen it yet? Man, you're in for a surprise." "Seen what?" Trevor asked, his stomach tightening with a sudden sense of dread. Before Miguel could answer, Lisa, the floor manager, emerged from the office. "Trevor, a word please," she said, her expression unreadable. The walk to the office felt like the longest of Trevor's life. Had someone complained about him? Was he about to be fired? He'd worked at Le Ciel for 3 years, building a reputation as one of their most efficient servers, though admittedly he saved his best service for those who looked like they belonged. Inside the small office, Lisa gestured for him to sit down. Instead of speaking immediately, she turned her computer monitor toward him. On the screen was a business magazine's website, featuring a headline: Blackstream Technologies announces $500 million expansion, plans to invest in local businesses. Trevor stared at the screen, not understanding what this had to do with him, until he saw the photo. His blood ran cold as he recognized the man from last night's corner table, now dressed in an impeccable suit, standing confidently on a stage. "James Robinson," Lisa said quietly, watching Trevor's face. "CEO and founder of Blackstream Technologies. Currently worth about $3.2 billion. And apparently," she added, "a very forgiving customer, considering how you treated him last night." Trevor felt the color drain from his face. That was James Robinson. The James Robinson. Lisa nodded. "The very same. The couple at table 12 complained about how you treated him. I noticed it myself when I brought his dessert." She sighed deeply. "Trevor, what were you thinking?" "I didn't know who he was," Trevor stammered, his mouth dry. "That's exactly the problem," Lisa said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You shouldn't treat anyone differently based on who you think they are or aren't." The truth of her words hit Trevor like a physical blow. He hadn't just been rude to a customer, he'd revealed a side of himself he wasn't proud to acknowledge. "There's more," Lisa continued, scrolling down the article. "Mr. Robinson is looking to partner with local businesses for a community initiative. Le Ciel is on his list of potential restaurant partners." Trevor felt sick. Not only had he insulted one of the most successful businessmen in the country, but he might have cost the restaurant a valuable partnership opportunity. Am I fired?" he finally managed to ask. Lisa studied him for a moment. "No, but this is your final warning, Trevor. We've had comments before about you treating certain customers differently than others." Trevor nodded, relief mingling with shame. "What I don't understand," Lisa continued, "is why he left you such a generous tip after how you treated him." Trevor remembered the simple note on the receipt. "The food was wonderful, wishing you continued success." No complaint, no angry words, just class and grace from a man he treated with neither. "I don't know," Trevor admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. As he left the office, the weight of his actions pressed down on him. Throughout the restaurant, staff members were huddled around phones and tablets, looking at the same article, whispering about how the James Robinson had been in their restaurant last night. "Did you know who he was?" a busboy asked Trevor as he passed. "No," Trevor replied honestly. "I had no idea." But the truth was more complicated than that. Trevor hadn't known who James Robinson was, but he had made assumptions based on his casual clothes and the color of his skin. He'd decided, in an instant, that James didn't belong in a place like Le Ciel, and he'd been completely, embarrassingly wrong. As he tied on his apron for the lunch service, Trevor couldn't shake the image of James Robinson, calmly enjoying his meal despite the poor treatment, leaving a generous tip, and walking out with dignity. How many other people had he misjudged? How many connections, conversations, and relationships had he missed out on because of his quick assumptions? For the first time in his career, Trevor felt truly ashamed of his service, not because the customer turned out to be famous, but because he shouldn't have treated anyone that way, famous or not. A week had passed since Trevor's humbling discovery. The restaurant had been buzzing with the story, and Trevor had endured endless teasing from his coworkers. Some joked that he should start a side business identifying undercover billionaires. Others weren't as kind, pointing out that his behavior reflected poorly on all of them. Trevor had spent the week in a strange state of reflection. He'd always prided himself on being able to read customers, to know who would tip well and who wouldn't. Now, he questioned everything he thought he knew. Wednesday evening at La Ciel was typically slower than weekends, and Trevor was setting up his section when Lisa appeared at his side, looking nervous. "You need to be perfect tonight," she said in a low voice. "What's going on?" Trevor asked, straightening a fork. "James Robinson just called. He's bringing his executive team for dinner in an hour." Trevor froze, his hands still on the silverware. "Here? Tonight?" Lisa nodded. "The reservation is for 8 people. It's some kind of business dinner." She paused, watching his face carefully. "I can assign them to Daniel's section if you prefer." The offer was tempting. Daniel was their best server, smooth and professional with important guests. But something in Trevor wouldn't let him take the easy way out. "No," he said finally. "I'll take the table." Lisa looked surprised. "Aren't you sure? After what happened?" "I'm sure," Trevor said, more confidently than he felt. For the next hour, Trevor was unusually meticulous, checking and rechecking every detail of his section. When the hostess signaled that Robinson's party had arrived, Trevor's heart began to race. Through the front windows he could see them, a diverse group of well-dressed professionals led by James Robinson himself. This time, Robinson wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Trevor's monthly rent. There was no mistaking his status now. As the group was led to a large round table in the center of the restaurant, Trevor took a deep breath and approached. He could feel every eye in the place watching him, his co-workers, the other diners, probably even the kitchen staff peering through the service window. "Good evening and welcome to La Ciel," Trevor began, his voice shakier than he would have liked. He forced himself to look directly at James Robinson, whose expression revealed nothing. "My name is Trevor, and I'll be your server tonight." James looked up, recognition flashing across his face. Something Trevor couldn't read passed behind his eyes. Then, to Trevor's complete shock, James smiled. "Hello again, Trevor," he said pleasantly, as if their last encounter had been completely normal. An awkward silence fell over the table as the other executives, who'd clearly been told the story, glanced between James and Trevor with curious expressions. Lisa appeared suddenly at Trevor's side. "Mr. Robinson, we're honored to have you back at La Ciel. If you prefer, Daniel is available to serve your table tonight." James looked at Trevor, who was fighting the urge to stare at his shoes. "Actually," James said, "I'd like Trevor to be our server, if that's all right." Trevor's head snapped up in surprise. Lisa looked equally shocked but nodded professionally. "Of course. Trevor, please make sure Mr. Robinson and his guests receive our very best service." As Lisa walked away, Trevor stood frozen, menu folders clutched in his hands. "Well," James said with a small smile, "perhaps we could start with the wine list." "Yes, sir, right away," Trevor said, handing out the menus with careful precision. His hands were sweating, and his mouth felt like cotton. As he turned to get the wine list, one of the executives, a woman with kind eyes, said quietly to James, "Are you sure about this, James? After what you told us?" "Absolutely," James replied, just loud enough for Trevor to hear. "Everyone deserves a second chance." Those words followed Trevor all the way to the wine station, a second chance. The very thing he hadn't given James when he'd walked in looking too casual for La Ciel. When Trevor returned with the wine list, James took it with a nod of thanks. The group began discussing options, and Trevor stood attentively, determined to provide the best service of his career. "The 2016 Bordeaux is excellent," Trevor suggested carefully. "It pairs wonderfully with our beef dishes." James glanced up at him with an approving nod. "We'll take 2 bottles to start," he said. Then, turning to his team, he added, "Trevor knows his wines. We're in good hands tonight." The simple vote of confidence nearly knocked Trevor over. Instead of the humiliation he'd expected, James Robinson was treating him with professional respect, something Trevor hadn't offered him during their first encounter. As the evening progressed, Trevor began to realize this wasn't just a business dinner. It was a test, not of his service skills, but of his character. And somehow, for reasons Trevor couldn't yet understand, James Robinson was giving him the opportunity to pass. The business dinner was going surprisingly well. Trevor moved around the table with newfound attentiveness, making sure water glasses stayed full and wine poured freely. The executives from Blackstream Technologies seemed impressed with both the food and service, often complimenting dishes as Trevor presented them. Through it all, James Robinson remained pleasant but reserved. He engaged warmly with his team, discussing expansion plans and community initiatives, but his interactions with Trevor were polite and professional, nothing more. As the main course plates were cleared, James excused himself from the table. "I need a moment of fresh air," he told his colleagues. "Trevor, could you point me toward the patio?" "Of course, sir," Trevor replied, surprised to be addressed directly. "I can show you the way." The restaurant's small patio overlooked a garden lit with string lights. At this hour, with the evening chill, it was empty of other guests. James walked to the stone railing and looked out at the carefully manicured shrubs below. Trevor stood awkwardly by the door, unsure if he should leave or stay. "Beautiful night," James said, still looking at the garden. "Yes, sir," Trevor agreed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. James turned around, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I almost didn't come back here." Trevor swallowed hard. "I wouldn't have blamed you, sir." "I don't think most people would have," James agreed. "But I found that avoiding uncomfortable situations rarely leads to change." A long silence stretched between them. Trevor finally gathered his courage and spoke the words that had been stuck in his throat all night. "Mr. Robinson, I want to apologize for how I treated you last week. It was unprofessional and wrong." James studied him carefully. "Why did you treat me that way, Trevor?" The directness of the question caught Trevor off guard. He could have made excuses. He was having a bad day, the restaurant was busy. But something about James Robinson's steady gaze demanded honesty. "I made assumptions," Trevor admitted, the words feeling raw in his throat. "I saw how you were dressed and I decided you didn't belong here." James nodded slowly. "And the color of my skin. Did that factor into your assessment?" Trevor felt his face grow hot with shame. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think it did." Another silence fell between them, but somehow less tense than before. The admission hung in the air, painful but necessary. "Do you know what I was doing before I came here that night?" James asked. Trevor shook his head. "I was visiting a youth center in the East Side neighborhood where I grew up," James explained. "We're creating a tech lab there to teach coding skills to kids who wouldn't normally have access to that kind of education." He smiled slightly. "Not the kind of place you wear a suit to." Trevor looked down at his polished shoes, the weight of his misjudgment heavy on his shoulders. "We all make assumptions that limit our vision," James continued. "The question is what we learn from those moments." When Trevor looked up, he was surprised to see no anger in James's eyes, only a calm intensity, as if he were genuinely interested in Trevor's answer. "I've been thinking about it all week," Trevor said honestly. "About how many people I might have treated poorly because of assumptions I made. It doesn't feel good to realize those things about yourself." James nodded. "Self-awareness is uncomfortable, but it's also the beginning of growth." He turned back toward the garden, giving Trevor a moment to collect himself. "You know," James said after a while, "one of my company's core values is everyone has something to teach us. I've found that to be true in every situation, even the difficult ones." Trevor thought about this. "What did I teach you, Mr. Robinson?" James smiled. A genuine warm smile that transformed his face. "You reminded me that my work isn't finished. That no matter how many diversity initiatives I fund or speeches I give, there's still progress to be made. And that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger, it's giving people the chance to see things differently." He glanced at his watch. "We should get back. My team will be wondering where I've disappeared to." As they walked back inside, James paused at the door. "Trevor, I'm launching a hospitality initiative as part of our community program. We'll need input from industry professionals. If you're interested, I could use someone with your perspective." Trevor stared at him in disbelief. "After how I treated you, you'd want my help." James held the door open. "Especially because of how you treated me. Sometimes the people who've made mistakes have the most valuable insights on how to prevent them." 6 months had passed since that night at La Ciel. The restaurant's patio, once empty on cool evenings, was now filled with people attending a special event. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved through the crowd with trays of appetizers. Soft music played from hidden speakers and string lights twinkled overhead. Trevor stood at the entrance, checking names off a guest list. He wore a new suit, nothing fancy but well-fitted and professional. His posture was different too. He stood straighter, made eye contact more easily, and smiled with genuine warmth as he welcomed each guest. "Is everything ready?" Liz asked, appearing at his side. "Just about," Trevor replied. "Mr. Robinson texted that he's 5 minutes away." Lisa nodded approvingly. "You've done good work with this program, Trevor. The staff has really responded to the training." In the months following that pivotal conversation on the patio, Trevor had taken James up on his offer to join the hospitality initiative. What started as occasional meetings had grown into a full partnership between Blackstream Technologies and several local restaurants, including Le Ciel. Together, they had developed a training program aimed at recognizing and addressing unconscious bias in the service industry. Trevor, drawing from his own experience, had become one of the program's most effective advocates. A sleek black car pulled up to the entrance. James Robinson stepped out, dressed in a simple but elegant suit. He spotted Trevor and approached with a warm smile. "Trevor, everything looks wonderful," he said, looking around at the transformed patio. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Robinson," Trevor replied, extending his hand. James shook it firmly. "I think we're well past Mr. Robinson at this point, don't you?" "James is fine." Trevor smiled. It still felt strange, being on first-name basis with one of the most successful businessmen in the country. But over the months of working together, a genuine respect had grown between them. "How are you feeling about tonight?" James asked as they walked into the event space. "Nervous," Trevor admitted. "I've never spoken to a group this large before." "You'll do great," James assured him. "Just speak from experience, like we practiced." The gathering was a celebration of the first graduating class of the Hospitality Equality Initiative, 25 service professionals from restaurants across the city who had completed the training program and would now return to their workplaces as advocates for change. When it was time for the presentations to begin, James took the podium first. He spoke briefly about Blackstream's commitment to community partnership and the importance of creating inclusive spaces. Then, to Trevor's surprise, he called him up as the true driving force behind the program's success. Standing at the microphone, Trevor looked out at the audience, fellow servers, restaurant managers, local business owners, and even a few city officials. 6 months ago, he couldn't have imagined being in this position. "My journey with this program began with a mistake," Trevor started, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger. "I treated a customer poorly based on assumptions I made about him. I thought I could tell who belonged in an upscale restaurant just by looking at them." He paused, finding James's encouraging gaze in the crowd. "What I didn't know was that the man I disrespected was James Robinson. But the truth is, it shouldn't have mattered who he was. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, whether they're wearing a 3-piece suit or jeans and a t-shirt, whether they look like me or not." The room was silent, all eyes on Trevor as he shared his story without excuses or self-pity. He talked about the shame he had felt upon realizing his mistake, but more importantly, about the growth that had come from confronting his own biases. The easy response would have been for Mr. Robinson, for James, to complain to management or never return to our restaurant. Instead, he saw an opportunity for change. "He showed me that true leadership isn't about power or status. It's about how you treat people, especially when they haven't treated you well." By the time Trevor finished speaking, several people in the audience were nodding in recognition of their own similar experiences, both as those who had made assumptions and those who had been on the receiving end. The applause that followed was heartfelt. James approached the podium and shook Trevor's hand, a gesture captured by the event photographer. That photo would later appear in the local business journal with the caption, "Unlikely partnership creates change in hospitality industry." As they stepped away from the podium, James leaned over and whispered, "See? I told you you'd do great." Trevor smiled. "I had a good teacher." Together, they rejoined the crowd, 2 men from vastly different backgrounds who had found unexpected common ground in a simple truth. Sometimes life's most important lessons come from the most uncomfortable moments, and genuine change begins when we have the courage to see beyond our first impressions.